You are listening to a free version of the Majority Report with Sam Steeder. To support this show and get another 15 minutes of daily program, go to majority.fm, please.
The Majority Report with Sam Steeder.
It is Wednesday, April 18th, 2018. My name is Sam Steeder. This is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America. Downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, Assistant Professor at Rutgers University, Domingo Morel, on Takeover, Race, Education, and American Democracy. Also on the program today, Mike Pompeo had a secret North Korean meeting. Won't keep him from failing with Senate Foreign Relations Committee, however. And Barbara Bush is dead. And in her honor, know that she will want us not to waste our beautiful minds thinking about it. Also on the program today, the Republican plot to destroy regulations by a method you had not even heard of. Apparently, Mattis wanted congressional approval for Syria strikes. And Trump's Buy American program is simply about more weapons sales. Trumper lover Mitch McConnell may still be a dick, but so too is never Trumper Charlie Dent. Anti-gun violence advocate David Hoggs calls for a boycott of BlackRock and Vanguard, investment companies with large stakes in gun companies. At the UN, Trumpistas claim the U.S. is an anti-abortion nation. And Puerto Rico suffering an island-wide blackout. All this and more on today's program. The island's power grid apparently remains unstable after Hurricane Maria last year. Good job, Brownie. They have, there simply haven't been the resources necessary to rebuild what's going, the power grid. And what are we now? 8 months? 6 months after Hurricane Maria? Pretty stunning. And equally as sad, just that there's no mechanism for the American public to apparently be aware or outraged at this.
September. So what is that?
6 months. 6 months. We will give you updates as we hear more on that. Meanwhile, James Comey is continuing his tour, and the best thing about it, I guess, is that it's annoying the right people, although I have to say it's also sort of annoying me. And I am not necessarily the right person to enjoy being annoyed. But with that said, the most effective thing that James Comey, I think, is saying, and look, because here's the bottom line. I don't think there is a scenario where Donald Trump loses politically any more than he's going to lose. In other words, it's conceivable after he's president, he's going to go to jail. But, and I know there are some who say, well, we don't know for sure if a sitting president can be indicted or not. This president will not be indicted but for an act by the Republican Congress and then the Republican Senate. Now, that may change after 2018. You may have a Democratic House, maybe, unlikely, a Democratic Senate. But Donald Trump's not going anywhere. However, it is, I think, probably of some value to have James Comey out there saying the following. I don't think it's hugely valuable, but it's at least worth the minute and a half it takes to hear it. So here is an ABC News report on James Comey's expressing how the Republican Party has lost their way.
TV. Comey told Stephen Colbert that President Trump's tweets attacking him are like a breakup that Trump can't get over. Comey has also been talking to ABC's Brad Milkey. Brad, good morning.
Hey, guys. James Comey has said a lot recently about President Trump. But when I spoke to him one-on-one, I wanted to know how he felt about the Republican Party, because he used to be a Republican. And now he says emphatically the GOP has lost its way.
In your heart of hearts, do you still consider yourself, though, a Republican?
No. The Republican Party has left me and many others. I need no better evidence than their new website, which I think is Lion Comey, maybe, attacking me. I just think they've lost their way, and I can't be associated with it.
When did you see that change take place?
Probably over the Trump presidency, and probably began during the campaign of 2016, came to the conclusion that these people don't represent anything that I believe in.
He went on to tell me he still respects some Republicans, Mitt Romney is one of them, but he doubts that he'll be stumping for anyone on the campaign trail anytime soon. He says politics still gives him that icky feeling.
Yeah, well, that icky feeling is the feeling you get when you really don't know what you're talking about. Like, I can see saying, like, I abandoned the Republican Party because they have a website calling me Lion Comey. Okay, that's fine. But to argue that there is something fundamentally different between the Republican Party in 2015 or 2016 as opposed to, say, 2014 or 2010 or 2009 is simply either deluded or just stupid. I mean, there was no space alien who came down and zapped the entire Republican Party. There's a reason why Donald Trump won the primary, because that's who the party was. Mitch McConnell, in breaking those Senate rules, I guess, or customs, or just norms, by not even holding confirmation hearings for Merrick Garland, had nothing to do with Donald Trump. The idea that the Republican Party would take someone like Max Cleland and multiple amputee or war vet and say that he's Osama bin Laden had nothing to do with Donald Trump. Lying the country into a war had nothing to do with Donald Trump. Starting a torture regime had nothing to do with Donald Trump. Cutting taxes for the wealthy and attempting to cut things like Social Security and Medicare had nothing to do with Donald Trump. Denying hundreds of thousands, millions of people Medicaid insurance had nothing to do with Donald Trump. What is different in terms of the belief set of the Republican Party in terms of issues? Now, granted, maybe now they're putting out websites saying Lion Comey, and they never did that before. But honestly, what is, I guess maybe the reason why he's broken with the Republican Party is because now they seem to be okay with some tariffs on China? Is that it? Is that what is that the big break? I mean, honestly, if anybody can point out,
I'm sorry, no, Bush slapped tariffs on China too in the lead up to 2004. People don't remember that, but he did the same thing.
I mean, what is it that James Comey? I mean, maybe we'll just wait.
Plausible concern that the current leader of the Republican Party was peed on by Russian hookers.
I mean, look, that's fair enough.
It would be useful if you would say, part of the reason I felt so pressured to make that dumb decision about making that announcement about the investigation was because there was a rabid party, and it's insane. And
well, that's the other thing, is that Comey announces this as a way of protecting essentially the integrity of Hillary Clinton, of the investigation, and to protect Hillary Clinton and Comey himself from charges when she becomes president that this is a vindictive move because Donald Trump had said that he was going to prosecute her. But left out of that equation is the fact that he's got to do this in light of the fact that the Republican Party is a bunch of lunatics. So, I don't know. James Comey, ladies and gentlemen. Folks, I mentioned this yesterday on the program, and it's been super helpful. It is a great way that I'm using to just make sure that I can keep up with this sort of avalanche of news. Are you tired of seeing ads when you want to read the news? There's nothing worse. Are you sick of having social media filter your news? You feel like you're missing out on breaking news? You can download Smart News for free in the App Store or Google Play Store. Get your news in real time from over 300 trusted sources, including CNN, Vice, Politico, HuffPost, The Hill, more. Smart News' algorithm automatically curates the must-read stories that matter now. And they have a bunch of, what do you call those? Like silos or verticals. Sports, entertainment, politics, U.S., international. There's more. Plus, you can read the news wherever you go, and even when you're offline. You'll get your news in just a minute. No wonder Smart News already has more than 25 million users worldwide. Yesterday, what was it yesterday that that I found on Smart News that you'd forgotten about, Brent?
Oh gosh! Jesus.
Oh, the Chinese
North Korea
Korean peace.
That's it.
Matt did it. Matt even messed up the headline. Jesus, we're really doing a lot of empowering of this terrifying post-research world.
Smart News, folks. It's available for free in the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store. It's Smart News. All right, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to talk to Domingo Morel, assistant professor at Rutgers University, on his book, Takeover, Race, Education, and American Democracy. We'll be back in just a moment. We are back. Sam Cedar on the Majority Report. On the phone, it is a pleasure to welcome to program Domingo Morel. He's an assistant professor at Rutgers University, Newark, on his book, Takeover, Race, Education, and American Democracy, released on the Oxford University Press this year. Domingo, welcome to the program.
Hey, thanks for having me, Sam. Glad to be on.
Okay, so let's just place into context the process and the circumstances of what leads to the takeover, and we're talking about the state takeover of a local school district. In general, what's the process, and what are the circumstances that lend us to that situation?
Yeah. So there have been different iterations of state takeovers, but the policy of a state takeover really emerges in the 1980s, and they late 1980s out of this kind of accountability, kind of reform movement, based on the idea that schools that are not doing well, not performing well academically, or have financial issues, need to be taken over by their state governments in order to, A, produce better educational outcomes and have better management of the schools, financially and otherwise. And so this is starts to really happen in the 1980s. By the 1990s, 2000s, it picks up. And currently there's kind of a different type of takeover that we are starting to see happen now with places like New Orleans and in Tennessee and so forth. We can talk about that at greater length later on, but that's what we start to see happen. And so again, it's an initiative, intervention based on the idea that the school districts are not doing what they need to be doing in producing the adequate education for their students.
Because it feels like there are a couple of different eras in which the takeovers operate, and let's start with the 80s in terms of when these laws first started to emerge. Because I think by the time we get to the 2000s, and we're talking a place like New Orleans in particular, it becomes more of the privatization. The impetus seems to me, at least, to be somewhat based in privatization of schools and the sort of the introduction of charters and whatnot. And I wonder if, like, the 1980 laws were in some way a function of national politics or pushback on things like busing, or what was more specifically, I guess, the impetus for these laws when they first got on the books?
Yeah, and so what I argue in my book is that most of the attention has been on whether these types of takeovers actually produce the desirable educational outcomes, right? And what I'm trying to argue is that it's really a political imperative, and so that we need to look at not just education outcomes like test scores, graduation rates, and so forth, that we really need to understand how the politics of takeovers shape the idea of a takeover and the implications that come after that. And so by looking at it from a political perspective, then takeovers start to make a little bit more sense. And so particularly as they emerge in the 1980s. And so what I argue in the book is that by the 1960s and 1970s, we have this centralization of state power. And that centralization of state power is a result of what's happening at the national level in the 1960s and the local level, late 1960s. And so, as you know, and many of your listeners will know, by the 1960s, under Lyndon Johnson, the national level government is taking on these policies and passing legislation that has a pro-civil rights agenda. So that's, the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act. And in addition to all of that, we see under Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society programs, the expansion of dollars that go from the national government directly to cities in ways that we've never seen before in our history in the 1960s. And guess what? These dollars are going now to cities that are increasingly becoming majority black and are increasingly led by African-American leaders at the school board level, at the city council level, and eventually the mayoral level. And so there is a response to all of that by conservatives, which by the late 1960s, early 1970s are consolidating within the Republican Party. They find that their level of to gain influence and to gain power, it has to be at the state level, since we see what's happening at the national and we see what's happening at the local level. And so, many people are familiar with this new federalism that was, pushed by Nixon and then eventually expanded by Reagan, this idea that power was being devolved, decentralized from the national level to the state level. That was in response to that. And in addition, while that's happening, this devolution from federal power to state government, state governments start to centralize power and start intervening in localities in ways they had never done before. And we see this happening most prominently with education. And education happened to be one of the few areas in the 1980s where actual funding to localities is increasing, right? And so this consolidation of power at the state level by conservatives is a response to that growth of black political empowerment in cities, because black political empowerment presented political challenges to these conservatives. And, what I write in the book, that there's two major challenges. One is that African Americans are gaining political power in cities, and they're becoming influential not only in cities but in states because of the heavy concentration of population in these central cities. And so that means that they have power not only in cities but in their states. And in addition to that, these communities, in black communities, they're making demands for more resources for their schools, and they're actually winning. They're winning court cases that lead to more funding. And so the conservative response to this is to intervene in schools, and takeovers only happen as a policy. So states start to pass takeover laws only after communities actually win court cases securing more resources, right? And so we don't get state takeovers of local school districts without that. We don't get, first, communities have to win. And this is, again, between the 1980 and 2000, that period that you're talking about, which in my book I call the incubation period of takeovers. These takeover laws only get passed after communities actually win these court cases. And so one of the, I think, interesting data points in the book is, between 1980 and 2000, there are 18 cases where plaintiffs win court cases to secure more resources, and in 14 out of those 18 cases, states pass takeover laws.
Wow.
The only states that don't pass takeover laws are Montana, South Dakota, Vermont, and Wyoming. And so I don't have to tell you what the percentage of black residents is in these states, but they happen to be the whitest states in the country. And so takeover laws are passed in response to this. And so without this, and without black political empowerment in cities, we actually don't get state takeovers of local school districts.
That's fascinating. And so, now let me just back up for a moment, because the argument, the thesis that you're making here is that it is inherently informed by race and by a racial dichotomy between power that is at the very least accessible to black folk and to minorities in the urban centers, and this is a challenge to the authority of those in the state houses who, for the most part, tend to be white. Is there any data on the educational outcomes? I mean, so that we can, shift more to the sort of like the implications for democracy and the political power. Is there any data for educational outcomes? Like, is there any evidence out there that when a state takes over, you get these sort of dramatically better educational outcomes, which could possibly justify it?
Yeah. So to that question directly, so the results are mixed, and particularly the research that we saw happen during this period, again, the 1980s to early 2000s, it's really mixed. And so there's no conclusive evidence at this stage where takeovers actually lead to better outcomes. We can talk about, later research and so forth. But what I do want to make the point, I think the major point here is that these school districts are clearly struggling. They have always struggled. And so I think that, that's important for us to understand. But the research, what the research is pretty clear about is that if we're going to improve school districts, we need collaboration. We need all hands on deck. We need the state to be invested. We need the national government to be invested. But a key component to all of this is that you can't eliminate the local community from the decision making. That just is not going to lead to better outcomes. And so, going back to your main question here is that these districts clearly have struggled. And in fact, one of the main case studies in my book is the city of Newark. And so I argue, I show, looking at historical account of the city of Newark, in 1967, what most people call a riot, Newark is actually called a rebellion, took place in Newark where 23 people died. And the year after, the governor of the state of New Jersey commissioned a study, and that study pointed to all of the factors that led to this uprising in Newark. And one of the major factors were the schools. And the reports stated that, number one, you had a majority African-American population that had no political power when it came to the schools, and so that it needed to address that. That was one of the points of resentment. And number two, that the schools were dismal. They weren't. They didn't have the resources that they needed. The buildings were falling apart. They didn't have enough teachers. The dropout rate was over 30%. And most of all, they didn't have enough seats for every Newark student to be able to attend the schools. And so this is in 1967, 1968. What the community decides to do as they gain political empowerment is to advocate for more resources and to do the kinds of things that they need to do to improve the schools. And it's precisely at the time that they're actually gaining the resources because of these court cases in the state of New Jersey that the state comes in and takes over the school district. And so I just want to be very clear that the argument here is that these school districts are, stellar and the takeovers are happening. No, these schools are struggling, but that the key to improving the school districts requires collaboration and requires effort from all parties, including the local communities, which they did. And they have continuously done. And it is, I argue in the book, it's precisely because they're doing the kinds of things that they need to be doing and fighting for their kids and fighting for more resources that it invites these types of intervention.
And so the intervention becomes a way to make sure that the resources are controlled by the right people.
That
or
and also,
depending on your perspective, I guess. Somebody locally would say the wrong people, but from the state's perspective, we don't have access. These are federal dollars. They're bypassing us. We want to be able to control how those are spent. And I think, go ahead.
So just to be clear, I just want to, because it's not really federal dollars, it's actually state dollars, which is critically important to the story here. Federal dollars only account for about 10% of local funding across the board. And so the increase in funding is actually coming from the state government, which kind of produces this resentment that we see by non-urban state legislators.
And it's funding that comes from the state, but it is mandated by, in the wake of a court order that's saying you're underfunding this, and states tend to have, and I wonder how much this is in play in these states that you talk about too. When you have a finite number of these takeovers, how many of these court orders are predicated on a state constitution that says the state has an obligation to educate all of its citizens?
Well, so in these court cases, again, going back to this period, the incubation period between 1980 and 2000, these court decisions, the courts are making these decisions based on their constitutions and saying that these schools need to be funding, the states need to be funding these schools adequately based on their constitution. So this is a critical part of it. And the first state where this happens is in New Jersey, becomes kind of like the model for other states to follow. And, I argue there's no surprise that because New Jersey becomes the first state to do this, based on what their constitution says, that it becomes the first state in the country to pass a state takeover law and the first state in the country to actually take over a school district in 1989, the Jersey City schools.
And you make the point in the book, too, that not only is this a question of maintaining control over resources, but that school boards tend to be the point of entry for people of color into politics because of, I guess, the localized nature. Is that what it is? What's going on there? Because, and I would just add that, we're seeing this, in about 3 or 4 red states that tend to be a little whiter, but we saw this in Chicago. It seems to me that teachers are a and issues around education tend to have the ability to expand into other issues into the community, because I think a lot of educators will tell you that if we have, frankly, a poor community, a community living in poverty, the educational outcomes are going to be totally implicated by that.
Yeah. And so, when marginalized communities, and we're talking particularly here about African American communities and Latino communities, when they don't have the access to levers of political power, and we saw this particularly in the 1960s and 1970s, the path to political empowerment was the schools. So where they couldn't participate anywhere else, they were able to participate or try to influence school politics. And then eventually the path to political empowerment was paved through the schools. So before we had Black mayors and before we had Latino mayors, we've had Black and Latino city council members. And before we had Black and Latino city council members, we had Black and Latino school board members. And so that's the trajectory. And so political empowerment in these cities is through the schools. And so one of the major questions that I was, motivated my research was thinking about takeovers really as again, this political policy, and thinking about what types, knowing that the school boards and schools in general are critical parts of a community's political empowerment, how are takeovers affecting this? And with the research I find is that it's having an effect on school boards, but beyond school boards as well. It's having it's basically excluding people from the decision-making process. And once you take the foundation away from a community, which the schools serve as the political foundation of a community, then it has implications beyond the schools as well.
All right. Well, yeah. I mean, talk about those. So, if we see a situation where you have a takeover of a school board, does that necessarily, and I know this isn't the case in the other city that you were looking at in Central Falls necessarily, but does that implicate the rise of political power for marginal communities? Does it diminish the political power of communities because you've basically choked off the path to a further political empowerment through those school boards?
Yeah. So the research began, and I'm glad you mentioned Central Falls, because it began with what I considered a puzzle. And so Central Falls, a small city and the smallest state in the country in Rhode Island, they actually had experienced a state takeover in the 1990s. And at the time, so you had a significant Latino population. By now, today, it's a majority Latino population. Then they represented a significant but not a majority. And they had no political representation at the school board level, city council, or mayor's office. And the takeover in the 1990s resulted in the abolishment of the locally elected school board, which was an all-white school board. And once they appointed a new board, it had Latino representation and signified the first time in the city's history where they had any Latino representation at any level of government. And the research on school boards is pretty clear about this, that once you have marginalized communities have representation on a school board, then that opens up the path to other levels, as I was mentioning earlier. And that's precisely what happened in Central Falls, where they then had Latino city council members, and then now they have a Latino mayor. And so what I found puzzling was that this was all ignited by the state takeover of a local school district, which seemed to be different than what was different cases that was happening elsewhere. And so that's what began my research here. And so I started creating a data set to look at takeovers across time and to see their implications on school boards. And so while the Central Falls case presents an example of how the state can actually provide opportunities for historically marginalized populations to enter the public sphere, have influence over school safe policies, it turns out to be an outlier. So most cases are not like the Central Falls case. Most cases, most takeovers are actually in Black communities where the school board is abolished, and half of the cases, roughly, they are a new board is appointed, and the other half, the school board is not replaced at all. So you have districts in the South, for example, like in Arkansas, and Alabama and Mississippi, where these takeovers result in the complete abolishment of the local school board. And so takeovers for Black communities have been particularly detrimental and very punitive. And so beyond that, we know that the schools are a economic foundation as well for a city. And so a city like New Orleans, for example, who experienced their takeover, it actually happened in 2003, but it really went into effect after Hurricane Katrina. That takeover resulted in the decrease in the Black teaching force. So whereas New Orleans had about 75% of the teachers were African American from New Orleans in the New Orleans school district, by now, in 2015 numbers, their teaching force decreased from roughly 75% to about 50%. So 25% decrease in Black teachers. So you get the removal of a school board, you get the decrease in the teaching force, a Black teaching force, and also school employees like the bus attendant, cafeteria workers, and all of these, people who represent the community but also have meaningful jobs within the school district and for the community. You remove these people as well. And so we see that happening as well in many of these cases.
All right, I want to put just like a pin in that for just a second, because that also seems to me to be partly a story of privatization, and that's sort of like maybe the second or third wave of the takeovers. I want to talk about that in a second, but do you have a sense of why in Central Falls there was this anomaly? Like, what was the context in which that the takeover did not end up basically shutting the community out and in this case a Latino community from these levers of power? Why did it happen that way in Central Falls, but in the other places you have a different outcome?
Yeah, and so this is a great question, and what I show in the book and argue that this is highly partisan. So first of all, over 80% of all state takeover laws are actually passed by Republican governors. And so this is a highly partisan dynamic. In Central Falls, you have Democratic administrations who have essentially looked at the Latino population as an important electorate for the Democratic Party. And, I write in the book, that the past couple elections in Central Falls, and particularly when the Latino mayor was elected, you had during the inauguration, you had lieutenant governors, you had all types of statewide officials attending the inauguration. And part of this is because this is an electorate that is critical now and will be critically important going forward for the Democratic Party in Rhode Island. And so there's no interest in isolating or alienating this community. There's an interest in cultivating their political power because it benefits the Democratic Party. And so I think, that's important because it's not what we saw happen in New Jersey, for instance, where, first of all, the takeover happens under Republican administration, but then the most severe policies that we see happen during the period of takeover was under the Christie administration. Chris Christie, of course, a Republican governor of New Jersey. And, when the community was fighting for local control in Newark, demanding more say from the school board and so forth, the response time and time again from Christie and his administration was, that they didn't care what the government, what the community had to say. And, that he said that's a literal quote from Christie. And he could say that because he doesn't need he didn't need the Newark voters. He didn't need the Essex County voters of New Jersey because they're not Republican and he could win without them. And so that type of mentality that we don't need these voters, we don't need to cultivate them, we don't need their support, leads to a certain type of hostile relationship that creates increases the likelihood of takeovers or similar types of interventions. And, you know, separate from the takeovers of school districts, I think similar things, and I write about this in the book as well, a similar dynamic we saw unfolding in Flint, Michigan.
Right.
Of course, you know, you are familiar, and
yeah, I was actually just going to ask
with the water crisis.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, did the dynamic of these takeovers of school boards, did that become the predicate or the idea behind the whole emergency management laws in Michigan, where we saw various cities being taken over by the state ostensibly because they were, ostensibly mismanaged, and then we get this situation in Flint, among other places, but most acutely in Flint, where, and I think people obviously are aware of this story. And in fact, just recently they stopped the bottled water program there. But you had a city government that was basically told, all right, you're going to get a new water system. It's going to save a few bucks. And there was no response to the fact that people were saying there's something wrong with our water that we're getting now from the Detroit River. Were these school takeovers sort of the model for this emergency management law?
Well, so the idea behind the emergency management and the takeovers based on these municipal fiscal issues, I don't discuss this at length in the book, and so I want to be very careful about saying that there's these clear. In terms of the policy, there's these clear parallels there. But I do think what is at the and I do write about this. What I think is shaping the idea of the takeover, the mentality, the logic, is consistent with these different types of takeovers, and that is that these citizens are not citizens. That that we can enforce upon them a certain type of policy and have. And not have any repercussions for it, not be accountable to them. And that's consistent across takeovers of school districts, but also I think applies to what we saw happen in Flint, Michigan. And again, you know, you stated it very nicely, the kind of summarizing what happened there. And the community was demanding action. They knew that their water supply was not that the water was not healthy, and they were making demands, and the local government officials were making demands. And even after all of that, state officials did nothing.
Right.
And part of the reason why they were able to get away with not doing anything was, again, because these voters are not critical constituency to these administrations, which are majority Republican. Right. And so just imagine a scenario where Flint and its neighboring, and communities like Flint, where they're critical to that political base in power, then you can see a different type of outcome or a different type of approach or behavior toward these communities. And in fact, that's what we see in places where you have Democratic administrations, and not to let the Democratic administrations off the hook, because they've also had their challenges. But in a state like New Jersey, for example, you can't a Democratic candidate for governorship cannot ignore Newark, cannot ignore Jersey City, cannot ignore Camden, right? Because these are critical cities to constituencies, and that means that they're already likely to have a different approach to these communities than a Republican governor who does not need to essentially pay attention to these constituencies. And that's what we see happening across the board. And so I think this is kind of like this type of dynamic is what led to a different type of experience for the Latino community in Central Falls.
Okay, so all right. So lastly, let's just address this sort of the first period of these takeovers you call the incubation. Is the second period or the what begins in the I guess in the 2000s? How is that period different? I mean, because the first one seems to be largely defined by a state government dominated by white people, frankly, who are upset that a court has compelled them to provide resources to minority communities. How is in the next period of these takeovers? How is that different, or is it?
Yeah, well, so there are a lot of similarities, but I do think that something has happened which is somewhat different. And I think we started to, discuss this early on in the conversation about kind of like the privatization, or what some would say, kind of like this neoliberal approach to education. I think that many actors have bought into like the charter movement and the privatization movement as a way to address schools. And that includes important aspects of the Democratic Party, nonprofit organizations, and state leaders, Republican and Democrats, have bought into this argument that the increasing charters, the privatization, these neoliberal policies will lead to better outcomes. And once they start to all embrace this, including the Democrats, then the strong arm of the state is no longer as necessary. Because all of the political actors have started to buy into this now, and so this is kind of like the new phase, and this is why we're starting to see. I would say I don't talk about this as much in the book, but future conversations I hope could help shed light on this. That when we see the return of local control to places like Philadelphia, New Orleans, and Newark, that they are. This return to local control, I think it's states are welcoming them in ways that they wouldn't have welcomed them before, because I think that the conditions are right for the state. These efforts are winning, efforts to increase the number of charter schools and so forth. And so once these policies are underway, and many actors have bought into the idea that this is the best way to approach education, then you no longer need the strong arm of the state and these types of interventions the way that we needed them in the 1980s and 90s and early 2000s. On the flip side of this, I do think that there is an emerging story here, which is that it's equally as important, is that there is a resistance to all of this. And so we see, obviously, the teachers fighting against this, but we see students fighting for this as well, man. Parkland students is just one great example of how students are mobilizing, but we see students mobilizing across the country. In Newark, in fact, the return to local control was made possible because of student resistance over a series of actions that included taking over administration buildings, including shutting down highways and so forth. And so there is this resistance to these types of policies. And so it'd be interesting to see what happens going forward.
Indeed. Domingo Morel, the book is Takeover, Race, Education, and American Democracy. Thanks so much for your time today. Really fascinating stuff.
Hey, thank you for having me.
All right, folks. Going to head into the second half of the program. Just a reminder, this show cannot exist without you, people like you, who become members and support this program. And when you support this program, we give you some extra content every day, and you can do so at jointhemajorityreport.com. Jointhemajorityreport.com. Generally, when you become a member, not only do you get the extra time, but we also generally cut out the ads. But, sometimes when we take a little break, sometimes it's tough to get back into the swing of things. But we do hope you have enjoyed today's Majority Report, presented to you by Smart News. Say goodbye to fake news, nasty trolls, the filter bubble of your social networks. Get your news in 1 minute from 300 trusted media sources with Smart News. Available for free, which is my favorite price point. In the Apple Store, the Apple App Store, or the Google Play Store. So check that out. Also, folks, do not forget that this is the month of April. There are only 12 days left in the month of April, approximately, because I can't remember if April has 31 or 30 days, or 29. Apparently no one in the studio
30 days have September, April, June, and November.
So there it is. Bingo. Thank you, Jamie.
Also, my mom's birthday is April 30th.
That doesn't mean that April 31st does not exist.
Right.
But nevertheless.
I half nailed that.
On the day that Jamie's mom celebrates her birthday will be the last day that you will be eligible for 30% off at justcoffee.coop. That's a way for you to remember now. Now,
It's a way for me to remember.
it's a great way for you to remember. But the fact is that if you're smart, you're making multiple orders between now and then. You still have time to order today. Get coffee in to taste it. See which different types of roasts or, I don't know, places of origin of the coffee that you like, and then go and buy a 5-pound bag. So justcoffee.coop. You don't need a coupon code this month. Head there, get 30% off. You will love this coffee, and right now it's incredibly inexpensive. I don't know what it is about April that they can afford to do this, but the shipping is free. Check it out, of course. Also, last night, TMBS. I'm sure Michael had some inappropriate things to say in the wake of the passing of Barbara Bush.
That was for patrons, but that is also true.
We are going to attempt to be much more reserved. Like I said, in the spirit, of Barbara Bush, to pay homage to her memory, she would not want us to waste our beautiful minds thinking about her passing.
Oh, I get it. It's coded.
It's not coded.
Totally coded.
It is literally her one of her aphorisms. Was that? Is it?
I don't know if I'd call it an aphorism.
Well, I mean, she was talking generally about not paying attention to those who died in Iraq. The hundreds of thousands under her son's tutelage.
I'll tell you whatever it is.
I would say,
I'm use it as a green light to make jokes about her.
But she said, "Why would I waste my beautiful mind on thinking about it?" And I think those are good watchwords in certain circumstances.
I don't know if that rises to the level of aphorism.
Yeah, it's not an
epigram.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I was trying to give her more credit than you guys. I guess
Why?
you were parsimonious in your providing of her. I just assumed it was an aphorism that whenever she had to think of people who died in wars that were started by either her son or husband, that she would not think about it because of her beautiful mind.
Jeb, come give Mom a rub. She needs to think of aphorisms.
Sarah Winchester and the Winchester gun family made a whole entire mansion with like a bunch of secret passageways to try to escape ghosts. That's how she dealt with the...
Oh, really?
Yeah,
that's
how she...
heavy.
That's lit.
It's a great Google. And
But
Barbara Bush is just like, I'm just not going to think about it.
That's actually kind of the opposite, though.
Yeah, exactly. It's polar opposite.
Yes. She is so haunted by it that she has to... And Barbara Bush was not. So you really have to admire her ability to completely ignore the human tragedy that was around her.
Yes, you'd ignore the ghosts.
And to be fair, also, she... I do remember when she toured the Houston Astrodome and realized that all these underprivileged people who got the opportunity to sleep in the Astrodome were much better off than they were when they were in New Orleans.
It's worked out very well for them.
Yeah.
It's exciting to be in a stadium.
Yeah. So, bless her heart. Bless her heart. She lived a long, very fruitful life. So, but you can check out TMBS on our YouTube channel or the iTunes store or iTunes.
You calling me a fruit?
iTunes. What?
It's a Jeb impression.
Oh, I see.
Fruitful life.
Right. I know. I get you.
Yes, Jeb. Everyone is calling you a fruit. Oh, now give Mom a foot massage.
I had a couple of lines as George Bush that I think I'm going to just hold off on.
No, dude. You got to do it with the fun half. Those were genuinely funny.
No, no. We'll see. I think maybe in my old age, she was never a politician herself.
You know what else I revisited last night?
She just was supporting people like that.
All right, yeah. We don't have time for subtlety. You know what else I mentioned last night was the bit that we did, and I don't remember when we did it on air or not, but that the Bush family are shape-shifting reptilians, except Jeb is the only one that doesn't have shape-shifting capacity.
I think we did do that.
And George is just like, let's go turn into hawks and drink
we're gonna go,
lizard blood.
We're going to go drink. We're going to go turn into lizards. Oh, sorry, Jeb.
Oh, sorry,
Guess you're going to have to
Jeb.
hang here at the house. Sorry. Sorry about that.
Like, why do you keep proposing activities I can't engage in? You know that I can't shapeshift and go torture animals.
Can't wait to go bite the head off a rat. Sorry, Jeb, it looks like you're just going to have to hang here.
They're all in final lizard form, like on some like rock slab, and Jeb's just out there in his swimming trunks.
just like wading into the water with a sad look on his face.
Hey, guys.
What's the matter, Jeb? Water's too cold for you? Fortunately for us, I'm not a warm-blooded creature, so I'm just going to hop into the pond. Sorry, Jeb. Yeah, sorry.
I'm all for othering the ruling class. Just put that on the record.
Jeb, you don't have the ability to transform into a lizard.
That's funny.
I think I got my eyes. I think my eyes have gone.
Nope. Hey, Jeb, just out of curiosity, how many eyelids do you have on one eye? Just one? Oh, that's too bad. No biggie.
Let's
All right,
see.
I got to stop right now before I move into the...
Just needed to work in a 2 terms, 1 term, no term joke in there,
Right.
too, and you would be done.
That's right. Sorry, Dad. Could you pass the peas to the 2-termer?
No terms, can't even
And
shapeshift.
Jeb, I'm sorry. I'm having trouble. Remember how I was always, you were saying I had that alcohol fetal problem and I couldn't add? How many, again, times were you present? I forget. I don't have the ability to add.
How fun would it be if you could just hang out with George W. Bush for an afternoon and just bully Jeb together? I would know, like 2 Jeb would have to be there and just torture.
He's like, I'll
Jeb.
answer anything.
Yeah.
He's like, just talk shit about Jeb.
Let's get
Mr. President. I just want to hang out with you and demean your brother, please.
Let's get George P. to come here and watch him. Watch us.
Almost
Give his dad a wedgie.
almost too easy to be fun.
Yeah.
Almost.
You're gonna watch us.
Oh my God, I would do that in a heartbeat.
Also, Jamie has her Patreon page. You can check it out at patreon.com/Jamie Peck. Quick break.
Sorry. I'm going to direct people to patreon.com/theantifada now because we have just released a new episode.
Maybe you need
I need to combine them somehow, but Patreon is
I have a
being
suggestion
really
for
obstinate.
you on that.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. It is a website with 2 big buttons.
What?
That's the way I would do it, right?
Like my own. I don't know how to make a website.
Well, wait till
You could do it with Squarespace.
Wait till we. I'm not going to give away a free advertisement.
I don't know what I was thinking.
We got to wait until we get the advertisement.
Capitalist
Then I
are
can
you,
tell
Matt?
you. All right.
Hi, Squarespace. I have a charge.
646-257-3920 is the number. 646-257-3920 is the number. We will take your phone calls. Also, we have some sound of, speaking of privileged and extremely privileged and really completely oblivious to their privilege. We have Meghan McCain scolding James Comey.
She's up there.
This is a tour de force, ladies and gentlemen, that we're getting.
Serious contender for dumbest person on the planet.
All right, we got to take a break. 646-257-3920. You can IM this program via the app at majorityapp.com. The app is free, ladies and gentlemen, and we're only like 5 years into the development of this app, and we still have not figured out a way of monetizing it. So you'll notice there's no ads, there's no cost associated for you. So might as well get it. Get it now before we figure out how to make some cash off this bad boy. We'll just redirect everything to Jamie's various Patreon accounts. That's the way we'll do that. All right, 646-257-3920. We'll be right back after this.
You are in for it.
All right, folks, 646-257-3920. See you in the fun.
Are you ready?
does this.